Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Jen Lund, who is the State of Maine Apiarist. I met Jen a few months ago as part of the Maine Science Festival programming that connected to our headliner event, the production of the play Queen at Penobscot Theatre Company. I didn't know Maine had a state apiarist, but after I heard Jen speak at one of the MSF sessions, I knew that I wanted to know more about her and her work. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Jen, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. It is a delight to have you. You have one of those great professional titles that I didn't even know existed, but now I'm jealous for, which is Maine State Apiarist. One of our guests prior to you was Sean Burkle, who's the Maine State climatologist. And I was like, I didn't even know these things existed. So I am absolutely going to have you explain what you do. But before we dive into that, I would love to know how you got into science, and you can lead into bees whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. I'm so happy to be here. I'm super jazzed to speak with you today and to kind of talk about bees. So I'm Jen Lund, as you said, and I work for the state of Maine. I'm with the Department of Ag Conservation and Forestry, and I am the state apiarist. And so most people ask what that is, and that is the fancy term for kind of the state bee inspector. I work with a lot of beekeepers throughout the state. But first, let's get to your other question, how I got into this. So when I was a small child, I was super into insects. I can remember from a very young age, I was always out collecting them and putting them in jars and hiding them around the house. My mom, many times, I could hear her yelling through the house, "Jennifer Lynn, get in here. What is in this container?" Because I just couldn't stay away from insects. My parents will tell you the story that I used to get notes home from the teachers saying things like, "Oh, you have to tell Jen to stop chasing around the boys with worms and with insects and stuff like that." So I was always fascinated with creepy crawlies as a young kid. And when I went to college, I went to a small school in upstate New York. It's called SUNY College for Environmental Science and Forestry. It's in Syracuse, New York. And it's a small college that focuses on environmental sciences. And one of their degrees, the one that I graduated with, was environmental and forest biology. And one of the requirements for that degree is taking a course in entomology. And I was in love. Like, I had finally found my calling. I realized that you could actually get a job and have a career studying insects, which I've always really been fascinated with. So I was offered a summer position for a couple of weeks to teach down in Costa Rica during, I think it was between my freshman and sophomore year, or sophomore and junior year, a enrichment class for a private high school in the town that I grew up in. They asked me to come down to be kind of the staff biologist for a couple of weeks for these kids. And when I got down there, I saw the diversity of insects, and that even just flew me over the edge. I just loved it. And so that just solidified that I was making a good decision. So I graduated. I started a master's degree at that same university working with Asian longhorn beetle. It's a beetle pest that feeds on maples and other trees and was really detrimental. So I'd already been to Costa Rica looking at insects, and then I got to travel to China. So I spent quite a few months there during the summers doing my research. I didn't end up finishing up my degree there. I ended up moving on before I finished, and I got a job at Cornell, also working with Asian longhorn beetle. They also sent me to China for the summers, which was really great. After that position, I moved to Arkansas with my lovely husband. I followed him in his career. Apparently, it's a lot easier to get a job as an insect person than it is as a fish person. So I'm a lot more marketable than he is. And so I moved to Arkansas and I started doing some research in cotton. And there was a pest insect, Lygus lineolaris, or the tarnished plant bug, that we were curious about there. And I started working a lot with fungal pathogens of insects. So fungus has turned into my second love. I am a weird person. I'm just going to say it right now. Like, most people look at me and they're like, "Wait, insects are your first love and mushrooms and fungus are your second?" Yes, absolutely. And then I was working down there for a little while, and then we moved to Maine. And I got a position working with inland fish and wildlife for a short period of time. So I was looking at salt marsh sparrows, not insects, but birds. But research was actually focused on what that species is eating in the salt marshes. So it's the insects portion of their food diet, and how we can better protect that, their food source, so that we can protect the bird. So I got the position. Most people would think of it as an ornithology or a bird position, but I got it because of my insect knowledge. And then I did a bunch of vernal pool sampling for marbled salamanders, which we don't have any longer in the state, but they were doing a survey of vernal pools and they needed somebody who could identify the insects that are found in vernal pools. So I was also working a herpetology position because of my background in insects. Then I got a position at University of Maine working with a invasive ant, Myrmica rubra. It's a stinging ant that is found in coastal areas of Maine and actually a little bit inland. We have a spot in Orono that they're also found in, and China and outside of Augusta, a little bit north of Augusta. But primarily most of my research was done on MDI. So I got to go down to MDI all the time and look at the ocean and get stung up by these ants. And we were looking at control options for them, everything from looking at pesticides to also nematodes and fungal pathogens. And then that position the funding was running out. So one of the things about scientists is a lot of times we work with what we call soft money, where it relies on grant funding for a couple years. You get money for a couple years, and then that money sometimes can be renewed depending on the grant, but often it just runs out. And so you have to kind of find more money or find something else to work on. And so my funding was running out for that position. And another faculty member in the department, this was the Department of Biology at University of Maine in Orono, Frank Drummond, he was passing me in the hallway and he heard that I was running out of money. And he asked me if I wanted to jump on this grant that he had just gotten for, I think it was a $2 million grant for working with honeybees. And so I said, first, I don't know very much about honeybees. And he said, you'll be fine. And then the second question I had was, can I get a raise? And he said, absolutely not. So I said, okay, great, sign me up. So I started working with honeybees. It was very different than what I had been working on before. Oh, I should interject too. While I was at University of Maine too, just for funsies, finish up my master's degree. So I worked with a beetle collecting wasp. It was Cerceris fumipennis. It collects members of the family Buprestidae, so they're the wood-boring beetles. And what this wasp does is the female goes out, collects beetles, stings them, paralyzes them, then brings them back to her underground nest and lays eggs on them. Those eggs hatch, and then they consume the beetle. And it was one that we were really interested in because of emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is one of those types of beetles that it collects, and you can actually collect the prey that the wasp is bringing back to determine whether you have emerald ash borer in the area. So it's a way to biomonitor for it. So that was a side note. But then I started working with honeybees and I worked on all kinds of different projects. It was everything from different types of hive design. So things from top bar hive to Langstroth and looking at whether they work in Maine. We also looked at control for varroa mites, which is the biggest pest of honeybees right now and probably will be for a long time. And we also were looking at a multi-state colony collapse disorder project, which we don't really use the term colony collapse disorder any longer, but that's the original kind of title of the project, was looking to see what causes hive to die or collapse. So I was doing that for a while. And then Frank Drummond, he pulled me into his office and he said, hey, I'm going to be retiring in 5 years. I'll keep you employed as long as I can. But if you find something that you want to do, feel free to jump ship. And so I had been kind of dabbling a little bit with working with commercial beekeepers. So these are beekeepers that have hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of hives. And it's a different style of beekeeping than most backyard beekeepers. So I took a kind of a little leave from my work with Frank during the winter and went down to Georgia and worked with one of the commercial beekeepers down there for the winter to see whether that was something that I wanted to pursue, an actual job in commercial beekeeping. And it turns out it's really hard. I loved it. It's wonderful, but you spend a lot of time on the road and I do like going home at night. And then a little while later, after that experience, the person who was in my current position as a state apiarist retired. So he left the position. He had been in it for 30 some odd years. And so he left and I applied and they gave it to me, which I'm still always surprised that I get paid to hang out with beekeepers all day. It's a really great, wonderful job. And I get to meet some really cool people. So I always joke with my beekeepers that they're going to see me for a long time because we don't give up these jobs very readily. It's something that we stay in until the end. And so I'm the second person to really hold this position full time in the history of this position. The first person was hired, Tony Jadzak, and he stayed in for 30 some odd years and then retired. And then I took the position.
So I have two things I want to circle back with. You said bees were unlike anything else you'd ever worked with or studied, and I'm curious why.
So bees are a social insect. They're very different than a lot of other insects in that they have a queen that's responsible for all the egg laying, and then they have overlapping generations in a hive. So they have her daughters are in charge of raising her young, raising the queen's young, but also going out and foraging. And then there are drones, there are males in the system, but there's only a few of those. Usually in a hive, you have a couple hundred, maybe out of 40 or 50,000 individuals. And they have only one responsibility, and that's to find other queens to mate with. And so they work as kind of a group of individuals as a whole. So having a colony of insects is very different than kind of anything. If we talk about things like the Cercis fumipennis, that wasp that collects the bupressid beetles, they're a solitary wasp, so they don't have a whole colony. So there's a whole bunch of things that happen in these social insects. And I did have a little bit of experience because I had been working with a social ant before that stung. But at the same time, it's very different when they fly and they can get away from bees. So with social insects, they have a whole different system of communicating. They rely a lot. If you imagine a colony of bees, they're in a dark space. And so they have to find other ways besides sight to be able to communicate with one another. So they rely very heavily on pheromones. So those are chemicals produced by one insect to communicate with an insect of the same species. For instance, if a queen is sick or dying, her pheromone changes or becomes less in the colony, and then the other bees know that she needs to be replaced, and they'll start raising a new queen. The same thing if, say, a larvae isn't getting fed enough, its pheromone will change, and they'll start feeding it more as a response to that. Or if an individual dies in the colony, they smell different. There's actually a death pheromone, and they recognize it, and then they remove it from the system. And so they communicate that way, but also they communicate using dance, which is really interesting. So they have this thing called the waggle dance that tells other bees when they come back into the colony, they'll follow those bees in their dance, and that dance will tell them how far and in what direction they need to travel to find that same food. So there's a lot of more intricate stuff that happens. You're not working with a single individual to see whether it responds a certain way, but you're actually looking at kind of a whole collective group of individuals to see how they respond. So it just becomes a lot more complicated.
As it always is with social animals, right? I mean,
yes. Look at humans. We are definitely very complicated.
So you said you get to hang out with beekeepers all day. I will say we met because you were roped in all the good ways by the Penobscot Theater Company with their production of Queen, which was the headliner event for the Science Festival this year. So I was the person who was able to actually watch you give talks. And I think I moderated one of them. And I just like, this is such cool stuff. You had a great way of communicating, but it made me care about bees in a way that I was aware of how important they were, but they're just there, right? I don't have to think about.
Absolutely. You don't have to worry about them. Yeah, they do their business and we just live there.
Well, except that you do have to worry about them from the context of the colony collapse, which you said that is no longer the nomenclature used, but it's still an issue, right?
Yeah, so we kind of look at it a little bit different. So colony collapse disorder was kind of a phenomenon that came up years and years ago where bees were kind of just disappearing. We now understand it better, and we actually kind of refer to it as bee decline now versus colony collapse disorder because it's a whole host of different things that act on a hive to cause it to collapse, and our other bees as well. So it's not just one thing. So we have two different kind of groups of bees when we talk about our pollinating bees. We have the social ones, which are honeybees and bumblebees, and then we have solitary ones that actually don't have big nests and they kind of do their own bee business. So the female will go out, provision her own nest, and she may lay maybe a couple dozen eggs and provision them with nectar and pollen, but there's really no help from other members of the same group. So they work solitary. So when we look at when colony collapse disorder kind of came on the scene, we didn't really understand it. So we thought it was a weird phenomenon that was caused by, we didn't know. And so as we've done more research, it turns out that it's actually a bunch of things that are collapsing hives. So we're talking about honeybee, social insect hives at this point. Things like varroa mites, which is a mite very similar to, they're very closely related to ticks. So if you imagine how ticks feed on us, it's the same way for bees. They have their own host of things, but these are mites. And they're probably the largest driver of loss for bees across the United States. But we also have issues with reduced genetic diversity. We have other pathogens and pests. We have loss of habitat and climate change. Those are really big impacts. They have really huge impacts on bees, not only our social ones, but our solitary ones. Pesticide exposure, of course, especially if you're using insecticides. Insecticides kill insects and bees are insects. and viruses. That's another big one. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are working on our bees that are causing hive loss. And so one of the things that I work with beekeepers about is kind of trying to mitigate some of these things. So making sure that their varroa mites are under control, that they're providing good forage and good food for their bees. And also just working out problems. Do they have a queen issue? Is it mite related? Is it disease related when they are seeing their hives struggling?
So when you work with beekeepers, is it mostly smaller backyard beekeepers? And if it is that, how often do you actually have to do things with commercial beekeepers in Maine?
I see both. So we have two kind of groups of beekeepers that we get in the state of Maine. We have migratory beekeepers that come from out of state, and they bring their hives into the state of Maine, usually for blueberry pollination. And we require a lot of pollination services, a lot of bees to pollinate those so that we can get the delicious berries to make all those beautiful blueberry pies that we eat and we love. And so we get somewhere between 40 and 50,000 hives a year that come in from out of state, from other areas to pollinate our blueberries. Most of them, probably about 80% of them, leave after 4 or 5 or 6 weeks of being here for pollination. It just depends on how long the flowers are out on those plants. And then they move out to other states and go to other pollination contracts. They'll go to Cranberry in Massachusetts, or they'll go out to Honeyland. So northern New York, Michigan, the North and South Dakota, where they can make a honey crop afterwards. The other 20% that stay in the state go up usually Aroostook County. There's really good honeyland up there. So when we talk about honeyland, it's where there's lots of good forage for the bees so that they can make honey from the nectar. So I do, while they're here, while the blueberry pollination hives are here, I actually do work with the commercial guys and I inspect their hives to make sure that they're not bringing any diseases or pests from out of state into state. And that's mostly to protect our resident beekeepers. We have about somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 resident beekeepers in the state that stay here year round. And they have about 10,000 hives. And so one of our big things is we always want to protect our resident beekeepers and their hives from anything from out of state that could potentially be a problem. So that's why we work with the commercial guys, and they have to be inspected before they get here and issued a health certificate from their apiary programs in their states. And so usually it's about a month, maybe 6 weeks that I spend working with our commercial beekeepers. The rest of the year, I'm working with our small scale backyard beekeepers. So we break up our resident beekeepers into 3 groups. We have backyard or small scale. Then we have sideliner, people who are maybe making a little money on the side with beekeeping. And then we have commercial. And for us, commercial in the state of Maine is anyone who has 100 or more hives. And we have about a handful, maybe 10 to 12 that have a couple hundred hives. But most people are in that sideliner, and the vast majority, about 95% of the state, is small scale, which is 10 or fewer hives. So yeah, I work with both groups, but most of my time, most of my year is with the resident beekeepers.
What makes good forage for honeybees?
Yeah, so good forage can be anything. Sometimes it's intentional. So people will plant things like buckwheat or canola or things like that. But most of the time, good forage land is just really open, sunny, kind of, if you think about when you're driving through Maine in August and you see that beautiful side of the road field that's all full of goldenrod and aster and a wide variety of different things that are flowering. The other thing that makes really good forage land is if there's been logging recently on some land and it's all grown back as raspberries and blackberries. Oh, that is some of the best honey, raspberry, blackberry honey. Oh, I love it. Bramble honey. And so pretty much just open land that has lots of flowers, a wide diversity. And you can even promote bees in your own backyard, kind of with the same concept. So turning any space that maybe you're not using as lawn into wildflowers or even cultivated flowers, anything that you're really planting out there, some pollinator will enjoy, whether it's honeybees or some of our solitary bees or even flies or beetles. Any flowering plants that you can plant in your yard will be appreciated.
So I want to circle back to the inspections that you do. 40 to 50,000 hives seems to me like a large number. How do you inspect that? I assume it's some type of spot check. How do you inspect it to ensure that our beekeepers here in Maine are not going to be adversely impacted health-wise?
Yes. So 40 or 50,000 would probably take me a full year. Our inspection program, we will look through thousands of hives a year. But what we do for the commercial guys is we make sure we see every single beekeeper's bees. So if we have those 40,000 hives really are only managed by somewhere between 20 and 30 beekeepers. So we make sure that we see every single beekeeper's operation, because if you've ever worked in any kind of large scale animal production, everything's very kind of the same. Like you have to do things the same way. You have to be very consistent. And so usually looking at a couple, and we call these drops. So if you've ever been out to the blueberry barrens during pollination season, how it works is you'll have some acreage of land and the beekeeper will come in and drop pallets of bees. And so there'll be somewhere between 48 and 60 hives in each location. And then they'll drive 200 feet down the dirt road and drop another 40 or 60, and then 200 feet down the road and drop another one. So you can see quite a few bees in a very small area, but they're very consistent usually. So if we look at half of a drop, and then we'll go to the next one, look at half of that, so 50%. Then we'll look at another one. And we usually look at 4 to 6 drops per beekeeper. So we're looking at somewhere around 200 of their hives or 300 of their hives when all is said and done. And very quickly, you see how consistent they are, and you'll pick up any problems very quickly with that sort of sampling. And then if there are any problems, that's when we start looking harder at somebody's operation. The other thing about it is that the blueberry producers, so the people who are actually producing the blueberries, they have used the same pollination people, so the same people for 10, 15, 20 years. And so we see their hives every single year, and we get a pretty good idea when there's something off. The other thing is a lot of these guys, this is their livelihood. So them getting a disease in there or a problem, they can't afford that. That's like losing their whole livelihood. So they're usually pretty careful about the state of their hives and what their hives look like or how healthy they are.
Have you ever found a problem in an inspection that caught something early that actually ended up helping the beekeepers that they didn't know about?
Yes, that happens a lot with our resident beekeepers. So we'll be in a hive and we'll start seeing like a sign of food stress. So one of the things with bees, if they're not getting enough forage. So the last 2 years, it's been really hard just because we've been so droughty. So plants are very conservative when it comes to producing nectar when there's no soil moisture. And so they'll produce flowers still, but they do not produce a lot of extra nectar. And so the bees, all of our pollinators don't get enough food during droughty years or have the potential to not get enough food during droughty years. And so the last 2 years, pretty much all summer, there's just been widespread drought everywhere. When we go into hives, it's one of the things that we look for. We make sure that the larvae, so the young baby bees, are floating in good food, that they're really wet and plump looking, that they don't look dry, because those are the first signs of food stress. And if we do see them, we often say to the beekeeper, hey, you need to provide supplemental food for them. And then in that case, they start feeding, and then those larvae plump right up and everything goes on target. If they don't, the hive really starts losing population because they start aborting larvae if there's not enough food to go around. And with the commercial guys, a lot of times they'll call me and give me a heads up before they even get here. So they have to be inspected. They have to come into the state with a health certificate from the state that they're coming from. So like if we have hives that are coming from Florida, they get inspected in Florida. Florida sends me their health certificate and says everything looks good. But sometimes a beekeeper will give me a heads up. They'll call me and say, hey, I've been really struggling with A, B, or C in my hive, so this is what you'll see. And then let me know if it's developing into a bigger problem, because this is what we've done to fix it. So this year in particular, we had a bunch of beekeepers that came from North Carolina. And when we were looking through their hives, just very spotty brood. So their egg laying pattern was very, very spotty. So I gave the beekeeper a call and I was like, this isn't a disease. You're having some queen issues. And it wasn't everywhere, but we saw it frequently enough that it was a little bit concerning. And so in talking to the beekeepers, it was because they had a weather event. It was really rainy for 2 or 3 weeks. And so any queens that they produced during that time period weren't able to get out and get mated properly. So the queens didn't have enough sperm to produce a really high quality egg. And so that's why we were seeing spotty brood. So it's kind of like, hey, a lot of these are actually requeening again because they realize that their queens are not great. So they're in the process up in Maine actually making new queens right now. So for those hives to supersede her. So we do a lot of communicating back and forth when we see an issue. It's not necessarily always disease, but if we see an issue, even with like queen quality or something, we'll let the beekeepers know.
Do you have to give a similar health certificate when they leave the state for their next destination?
Yeah, certain states do require it. For instance, a lot of our bees go to Vermont, some go to Massachusetts, some go to New York, and they all require a health certificate. Others will return back to the state that they came from. So if they go back down south, or some states don't require inspections, but most of New England does. So if they're going to another New England state, I issue those health certificates and then send them over to their states.
You're everywhere, Jen. Your name is everywhere.
And one of the things I say about the commercial beekeepers is that they get inspected like 10 times a year because they move around so much and so many states require these inspections.
I realize all this talk about the hives. Is there an average number of bees per hive?
It depends. So there's two different ways that people start hives. This is actually really fun. People get either a package of bees, and it's just called a package, or a nuke, which is short for nucleus colony. And so a package of bees is literally a box of bees with screens. So it's a wooden box with two screens on either side. So it's a box with screen and screen. And then it's got a queen in a little cage that's in there. And then there are about 10,000 bees in there. So it's 3 pounds. If you want to know how much 10,000 bees weighs, it's about 3 pounds. So they've dumped 3 pounds of bees into this box with screens. And then they put a little queen in a cage and then they cap it. They usually put like a food feeder in there. And then they cap it. And those come in the mail sometimes, or they get delivered by a distributor. So just like if you've ever bought baby chicks in the mail, you know, when you get that frantic call first thing in the morning from the postal person and they're like, oh, your baby chicks are here, come and get them. It's the same thing. You'll get that same call. Oh my gosh, your bees are here, come and get them. And so you just take that box of bees and dump it into a hive, literally just dump it. You take out the can and the feeder, you take the queen and put her little cage into the box of the hive. And you take this whole big box and you dump it, shake it like a big salt shaker into the hive, and all the bees go in and then they take up residence. So that's a package. And then there's a nuke hive. And that is about the same amount of bees, but that one is actually just a little mini hive. So it's got frames that the bees live on and a queen and workers and babies. And that actually 5 frames. So a normal hive is 10 frames that the bees grow on. And then you just put the 5 frames in there and then they expand out to the other ones and then you make your hive bigger. And that's also about 10,000 bees. So a starter hive is somewhere around 10,000 bees. And then as the season grows, they can get up to about 50 or 60,000 on a really booming hive. So that's at peak. So that happens sometime in July, late July-ish. And then the numbers decrease again in preparation for winter because it's hard to feed 50,000 mouths during the winter. And so our honeybees, they survive year round. So they actually survive the winter. And they'll get down to about 10,000 bees for the winter. So that 3 pounds is kind of the magic amount of bees. And so they'll reduce numbers. And then during the winter, when it gets really cold, what they do is they form this cluster where they kind of form a ball, like a tight ball. And the bees on the outside, they vibrate their muscles to create heat. And that warms the rest of the colony, all those other bees that are in that cluster. And then as those bees cool down on the outside, they rotate to the inside, and then bees from the inside rotate to the outside. So they can keep the temperature in their hive in that cluster around 70 degrees, even in the coldest parts of the winter.
That was one of the coolest things I learned in the different talks was we had a really unbelievably cold spell.
Yeah.
If you don't live in Maine in January, like I think with the wind chill,
it was like minus 40 or something.
Minus 40, it was crazy. It was so cold. And I lost track of how many of the beekeepers I was talking to said, oh no, our bees were fine. They were totally fine through that. It was the humans and the human houses that were the biggest issues.
Yeah. The honeybees are really resilient. They can take quite a bit. There are beekeepers all the way up in, Alaska and Alberta and like pretty much as far north as you can get in the country. There are people that are keeping bees. Yeah, the really, really much colder places. North Dakota.
What are those bees eating? Like the forage has got to be low there.
It's actually really good. So beekeepers in Canada, like in Alberta, there's so much prairie land because the forests don't grow very well, that there's so much prairie land that even though it's a very short season, they may have 4 to 5 months only of forage time, maybe even less in some of the really far northern parts. But it's all like there's no trees. So everything is just all wildflowers. So just like here, I often have conversations with my counterparts in other states in the South. And even though they don't have a winter season, they still go through long periods of time during the year where there's no food available to the bees. So where it's too dry, there's nothing blooming, or everything kind of senesces or goes to sleep for a period of time. And so their seasons, they don't have seasons kind of the same distinct as we do, but their summer is more like the middle of our winter where there's no food for the bees because there's just nothing kind of blooming during that time period. So it's beekeepers all the way down from the equator to probably just below the Arctic Circle keep honeybees.
What's the lifespan for a honeybee?
It depends. It depends on how hard their life is and what stage they're at. So the bees that are in cluster during the winter, they're living for 5 or 6 months. They usually emerge somewhere in September or October, and then they have to make it all the way through March or April. And so those are the longest living bees. We call those the winter bees, and they're actually physiologically different than summer bees. So summer bees actually have shorter lifespans. Typically, it takes anywhere from 16 to 24 days, depending on what it is. So a queen takes less time to develop from egg to adult than a drone. Drone takes the longest at about 24 days. And so anywhere from 16 to 24 days to reach adult. And then they'll probably be an adult for anywhere between 20 and 40 days, maybe a month, 6 weeks total lifespan, kind of give or take. It just depends on how hard foraging is. Foraging is really tiresome for a bee, but they don't start off their lives as adults. So we'll talk about worker bees a little bit. So worker bee emerges as an adult after 21, 22 days, somewhere around there. And then her first job, she starts working right away. There's no sleep for a newly adulted bee. So she just gets to work and starts cleaning out the cell that she just came out of. And then they actually have this thing, it's called polyethism, where as they age, they have different jobs. And so you see this a lot with social insects. So they start with the most basic, easiest jobs first, things like cleaning up cells, feeding young, wax building, so building new comb for the hive, honey processing. So they come back with nectar, which is really dilute sugar, and they have to get rid of the extra moisture in order to make that thick like honey. And then as they get older, they progress to defense. So they'll become the defender bees, the ones that are inside standing at guard at the gate at the entrance. And then their very last bit of their life, they spend as foragers. And foragers take the most brain power a bee needs is to find food. And it's also the most wearing on their bodies because you have to fly and your wings get tattered over time and you get stuffed by birds. So they kind of progress from the easiest jobs to more complex jobs. And even within foraging, they start off very naive and not knowing how to access the nectar in really complicated flowers, but they learn that over time. So there is quite a bit of learning that happens with bees too. So when they start off, they might look at things like forage on things like daisies that have a big open and all their nectar and stuff is right there and pollen. And then as they progress, they might start being able to figure out how to access more complicated flowers that you actually have to like maybe move a flap to get to the nectar to get the reward.
And that lifespan where they're doing the foraging and the hardest work is a couple of weeks?
Like a week, maybe 2. Yeah.
Wow. So is there just constant, I guess turnover is the right word, in the hive over
yes,
who's doing what and also how many bees are there doing all of this?
Yeah. So a queen lays at the peak of summer or peak of the colony size, she's laying somewhere around 2,000 eggs a day. So they can expand pretty rapidly, but there is a lot of turnover too.
I know so little about it. Like 2,000 eggs a day is a stunning amount. And she does that for how many days straight?
She'll do it for most of the summer, anywhere between like 1,500 to 2,000. And then the queen actually doesn't have very much say in what happens. She is just a laying factory. She doesn't control anything. So when we think about queens and monarchies, we think of a queen sitting up there and be like, oh, that person gets beheaded, or I need you to go fight that war for me. The queen in this case is just a laying factory. That's all she does. And so the workers actually decide kind of how much she lays and where she lays, and they'll push her around. So they'll move her around the hive and say, okay, we want you to lay over here now. Okay, we want you to lay over here. And so they kind of mitigate what she does. And if she lays too much, they'll actually pull out eggs. And like I said, if there's not enough food coming into the hive, they'll abort larvae. And then if she's not doing a good enough job, if she's not laying enough, they'll actually supersede her. So they'll start raising new queens. And then right when those queens are about to emerge, they'll kill the old queen.
Okay, so this was the part I wasn't going to get into because I find it wildly confusing and I don't know if we have enough time, but the idea of choosing a new queen and a new queen just appear, how does that happen?
So a queen is a worker that was fed extra food. That's it. That's all that it is. So worker bees are female. They have 2 sets of chromosomes. So males only have 1 set of chromosome. And so that's how this is actually chromosome-based sex determination. So they have double the amount of chromosomes in females. And so if the workers want to make a queen, so say, for instance, the queen is failing, her queen pheromone is going down, they're not getting the backup egg pheromone. So there's a pheromone that eggs produce that tells them everything's right in the world. Like, hey, we got lots of eggs. And as that decreases and the queen's pheromone starts saying that she's sick, they will make these special cells. So we call them queen cups. And they're just a larger cell that they would lay an egg in. And they push the queen over there. And they like hold her there until she lays an egg. They kind of just keep moving her over there over and over and over until she lays an egg. And then what they do is they just provide that egg with extra food. So normally a regular worker egg would be fed 1 to 3 days worth of royal jelly. So that's just high nutrition, high protein, high carbohydrate food that they feed all their young for the first 3 days. And then they stop and they just feed them normal worker food after that. If they want a queen, they just keep feeding her royal jelly, that high nutrition food, for the whole entire time that she's a larvae. And what that extra nutrition does, it allows her to develop ovaries properly. So that's the big difference between a worker and a queen. Queens are bigger because they're fed more food, but also they have fully developed ovaries. And so that allows them to become queens and lay eggs. So then they emerge as a queen, they go off and mate with a bunch of drones, then they come back, and then they just stay in the hive the rest of the time laying eggs. One funny thing, this is crazy, I'm going to make it even more complicated, is that a worker can actually start laying eggs if a queen goes missing. So if a queen goes missing and they don't replace her properly, so for some reason the new queen fails, she goes off to mate and she gets picked off by a bird, and there's no more eggs for them to make into queens because there's been no queen laying for a while. What'll happen is the queen pheromone will disappear, and then workers will start, their ovaries will start developing. And so they'll start developing ovaries and start laying eggs. Unfortunately, they can't go out and mate, so they don't go out and get sperm, so they can only lay unfertilized eggs, which become drones. So they end up just making drones. And if you think about it evolutionarily speaking, or evolutionary wise, that's kind of a last ditch effort for a colony to pass on its genetics. So as this colony, they know they're failing, all these workers start laying eggs all over the place. They can only make males, but those males at least will take the genetics of that colony and pass it on to another queen. And so the genetics will live on. So it's kind of their last ditch effort to pass on genetics.
This is mesmerizing. I don't understand how we figured all this out.
So I have to say that is one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is we still don't know everything about bees. We never will. But every couple of days, there's a new research paper that comes out. There's something new that we just discover that blows your mind. And so I get to learn. It's never boring. I get to learn something new all the time. It's never ending. And that's one of the things that I love about this position is that it's constantly learning new things. So you had also asked about the polyethism and how bees are always changing kind of their jobs and stuff. And yeah, there's a whole thing. This is just a new kind of study of research, and it's called precocious foraging. What happens if all of a sudden you lose a bunch of foragers in the hive? Like a whole life stage, all the foragers just disappear. So what they did was they took a bunch of hives and did just that. They got rid of all the foragers, they trapped them out, And then they kind of tracked what happened. And what happens is the bees that are doing kind of the easier jobs will actually become foragers faster. So they'll actually skip several jobs and then replace the foragers that are gone. And the same thing happens if all of a sudden you lose a whole bunch of nurse bees. Some of the foragers will go back and become nurse bees. And so there is this plasticity that goes back and forth. But the problem is that they find that if they get advanced too fast, they're not very good at their jobs. Or if they have to go back down, they're not very good with their jobs. And so it's like they forget how to do the easier jobs as they get the more complex ones. And they need more time to understand the complex jobs if they get promoted too fast. And so the hive isn't as efficient if it's forced to do that. So they do keep this like really nice balance where they have just the right amount of foragers and the right amount of food coming in and the right amount of bees that are being produced and the right amount of nurse bees to cover those. It's when we get that mismatch that we often see problems in a hive.
Can a hive recover from that? Have they done that work where like there's an unstable period, but at some point they right themselves and they go back to...
Yes, yeah, they can, as long as it's not like, so a hive that goes queenless and you have a bunch of drone laying workers, that will never right itself. Like it cannot, it just can't do it. It's a collapsing hive. And that's like last ditch, get some genetics out there, maybe go mate with some queens someplace else. So at least our genetic line doesn't die. But if you get a mismatch in the hive, you may see some issues like for a week or two, but eventually it then levels out where they do right it because they can recognize it's really mostly about scent. If there's too much egg scent and then not enough nurse scent or more distressed egg scent, so the eggs or the larvae are distressed, they're not getting fed enough, that like piques everybody and they're like, oh, everybody's not getting fed. We have to take some of these larvae out. It's constantly fluctuating and it's all feedback loops pretty much in there with scents. So all the different scents tell them what they should be doing, what needs to be fixed.
It's just so cool. I don't want to take too much more of your time because I could go for hours here. We just finished May and No Mow May was a big thing, at least up here where I live in Bangor. I'm pretty sure it was pretty impressive statewide. I have a habit developed from years ago where I listened to the Irish national broadcast. And it was a big deal there, too. They were talking about No Mow May. So
I was telling everybody that I was participating in No Mow May. It's just because I have no time May is what it comes down to.
Well, it's interesting because I think my take on it was totally geared towards suburban, urban little plots of land where we don't have a whole lot to mow or worry about. It's not geared towards people with acres and acres who have other things that they have to worry about, like ticks and things like that.
Absolutely. So I was going to say, I love it. It brings a whole month awareness of what kind of the plight of bees. And honestly, when we talk about the biggest drivers for bees, both solitary and our social bees, when we talk about big drivers of loss, habitat loss is one of them. And that includes forage and also where they're living. And so anything that we can do that can promote, especially in May in Maine, that's like prime dandelion season. Dandelion is one of the first big kind of flows that happen, like nectar flows for bees. It's a really great resource for them early in the season to help them build up faster and get their population going. But it's also, I think, anything that brings awareness to bees and helps people think about the things that they do in their yards that could potentially impact bees is really important. Because sometimes we don't think about the things that we necessarily do and how they impact the world around us. You know, we may think that we're doing A, B, or C, but in fact, it's actually maybe causing a problem for another whole group of things. So it's always good to have environmental awareness around our properties for all kinds of different things. The other thing is I live in one of those places where ticks, I have to mow paths at least, and we do. We mow our dog yard because otherwise they come back loaded with ticks. And then kind of the walking paths that we have through our acreage, we mow those because we also don't want ticks. And so it does come with some sort of caveat, like don't let everything go to crazy and then end up with Lyme's disease. That would be terrible. But at the same time, there are lots of things that you can do without, like just setting up part of the yard as a flower garden. And that can actually really increase bees. There was this great little study out in California. It was the University of Davis. They have like a bee research facility. And they counted the number of bees or the different species of bees. And they had something like 30 some odd bees that came to this wasteland. They had like this parking lot wasteland out in front of their things with some scrubby weeds. And they found like 30 different species of bees. And so they're like, we're going to put in a pollinator planting, some water, and see if this actually does help. And the first year after, they had like 40 species. So they had gained 10. And a couple of years later, when they remonitored, I think they were up to 80 or 90 species. I mean, and this was just like maybe an 8x12 section that they put in. I mean, it wasn't huge. It was tiny. And they increased their diversity that much. They just about doubled it. So it doesn't take much. If you provide food and you provide habitat for them, they'll come.
Are you doing any research or anybody doing any studies to see what impact NOMO may have on Maine in coming months and years?
I don't know if anybody's doing any direct thing, but that would be really interesting. They have found places, actually one really great resource along the same lines. There was, I think it's Wisconsin DOT, they stopped mowing all of their sides of their highways. And they tested before how many species they would get in kind of these right-of-ways next to highways and roads, their state road system. And then they monitored afterwards and they saw a marked increase in the number of pollinators, everything from butterflies to beetles to bees. And Frank actually a couple of years ago did one with our Maine DOT where they did these areas where they did not mow along the highway. And they also found between areas that had been mowed and those that had not, more butterflies, more bees, more other insects in them. So we do know that there is definitely an impact for this. There are several municipalities, at least for May, in Maine that specifically said they were not going to mow. I want to say Scarborough, maybe Auburn. Bangor might have been one of them.
Bangor was one. I remember it was, the beginning part of May up here, you're not mowing anything anyways. But the last 2 weeks, it's been actually kind of fun to walk around and you see, you're like, oh, they're doing it too. This is great. So it's been really interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we do, besides I think it was Wisconsin DOT, their study also looked at the reduction in fuel costs for the state for not mowing. And that was substantial. And then also the reduced CO2 output or savings, carbon dioxide savings too for the environment. And that was also very substantial. And then I think at the end of the season, they allow farmers to go and actually do the mowing to hay it all. So they actually get that back as well. I think that's what Wisconsin's plan was. So it ended up being a win-win-win. And I think they're continued with it for several years now.
That's really cool. Before I let you go, one of the coolest parts of your talk that I experienced was when you listed all of the foods that we rely on pollinators to make happen. I'm not going to make you list all of them because there's a lot. Like, it is a stunning slide. And I'm going to leave that there so people get inspired when they see that you're giving a talk sometime. They can come see you talk. But if you want to list maybe 5 things that we would not have were it not for pollinators, and this isn't just honeybees, right? This is any of the insects or pollinators.
Right. This is going to be our bee pollinated, and specifically, I can focus on that. So pretty much if you think about anything that you enjoy in life, it is bee pollinated. So all of the fruits and vegetables, so everything from blueberries to apples to raspberries, those are all heavily rely on bees to pollinate them, peaches. And then most of our vegetables, so things like tomatoes and eggplants and carrots, you don't think that they need pollination, but in order to get the seeds to produce carrots, you need pollinators, you need bees to produce those seeds. Yeah, plants don't produce seeds unless they are pollinated. That's the whole point of pollination. And so all of our fruits and vegetables, so everything that makes our food fun to eat. I think probably the biggest things, though, are chocolate. We would not have cocoa without honeybees or with bees in general. We wouldn't have vanilla, which I would be very upset about. And then also, this is probably impacts most people in their lives, would not have coffee without bees. So coffee, chocolate, and vanilla. I mean, I understand fruits and vegetables are good for us, but really when it comes down to it, when you're craving something, you're probably not craving a piece of lettuce or something. It's probably chocolate, coffee, or vanilla.
Yeah, it's a pretty catastrophic list if you think about what you will no longer have access to.
Yeah. And then there's also things like oils and fibers. So things like canola and buckwheat and cotton, those also would be really impacted. There is a talk that I gave for the Maine Entomological Society. I think it's still up on their website, all about the bees of Maine. So it was, I think, similar to that talk that we've referenced before, and it's free and open to the public. So if you search Maine Entomological Society and my name, it should pop up. I think they have a recording of it on there.
Oh, that's great. I'll find it and I'll put a link in the show notes once we release this. Jen, this has been a joy. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of things. We could easily talk about this more and more. I really do have a true newfound appreciation for bees in general, for honeybees in particular. And I am so happy that we have a Maine State Apiarist and that you're doing it.
Apiarist, yeah. Yeah, and I'm amazed most days that I get paid to hang out with bees all day and, beekeepers, but also just to talk about bees. I love spreading the word. I give somewhere, besides beekeepers that I talk to, I give somewhere between 40 and 60 talks a year about them. So I also love talking about them. I mean, I could talk for ad nauseum, and I do sometimes.
It's not too long for me. This has been great.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate so much for the opportunity to speak with you and your podcast. I'm super jazzed.
Cool. This is great. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Jen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.